Hear me clearly. Okay. So because I'm all alone here and I'll be presenting most of the time, I won't have the chance to keep reading the chat over here. I think I've skimmed through your backgrounds. I have an idea of what they are right now, which should be good. So if you do have a question, you can drop it on the chat, and after every 10 minutes, I'll be coming in to check them out. Or if you think you can unmute and talk, feel free as well. Just only unmute when you're asking the question, and you can always pause me at any time to ask me whatever questions you have. Awesome. So welcome, and let's get started. Okay, so this is our web development roadmap, and here we'll be talking about how you can start a career in web or software development. Cool. Some of you might already be in that, so you're probably familiar with a lot of the technologies I'll be talking about here, which is okay. But some of you might be beginners. Probably you've covered some of these things, but you just want a structured pipeline or rather pathway that you can follow to upskill into the field. And that's exactly what we'll be going through today. So the first question we need to ask ourselves is why should you even learn web development in the first place? So most of the time, people learn web development to fulfill the following tasks. So either you want to build a business website. So I've seen a lot of people who are entrepreneurs. They want to have that sort of autonomy over their own websites and build it. So yes, I could own a restaurant, learn a bit of web dev, the simple ones, HTML, CSS, and build my own website. So that's a simple approach to it. If you just want to build basic business websites, that's one way to think about it. The second set of people will be people who are now thinking of building advanced web application. This would either be advanced websites or web applications in this case. I think when I talk about web apps, think about the Reddit web application, the Coursera web application, something like YouTube as well. So from a day-to-day basis, we are all using this set of applications. We are accessing them through the web most of the time, at times through a mobile application as well, but here I'm mostly focused on web development, so it will be things you access through a browser. Most people learn web development to be able to build such applications, whether it's the front end design or whether it's that back end architecture. Cool. So as a web developer, here are some of the careers you can chart. One, you could opt to concentrate on the front end path and become a front end developer. Here you'll be more focused on how the website or web application looks to the end user. So you'll be focused more on the user interface over here. Whereas there's those of you who might opt to go for the backend developer track. And here you're mostly looking at the backend, right? The code that comes down that adds in the features, the databases. So it's not things that are quite visible to the end user. It's not more of the design things, but it's how your website operates and the code base that runs it in the backend, how you make things work within the website. Okay, and then finally, we'll have those of you who want to get into a full stack track where you learn both front end and back end. And most of people who tend to be proper full stack developers will tend to work in small startups because small startups don't usually have the resources to hire teams for front end and back end. So they always tend to prefer full stack developers who are comfortable all across the stack. I also recommend that you're comfortable all across the stack. But concentrate on something at some point. Don't become such a generalist, but it's good to have the general overview of building certain websites and then just know more of backend than frontend or know more of frontend than backend at some point. So it just depends with you, but I would recommend specializing, but still have that general overview. Cool. But web development is not just learning web development does not mean you can only become the three things I've talked about. So it's not all about front end or back end development. Sometimes web development could be a gateway to deeper software development careers. So a lot of web developers would tend to advance to mobile development. Yeah, you could be a front end developer and you want to now start designing mobile apps. So that's an option for you. Some developers would also get into desktop development. So it depends mostly with the pathway you choose and how easy it is for you to transit into desktop development. So that's usually how it goes. So you could also opt to get into desktop development. I have seen other people also get into data science once they're quite vast with web development, and they're going there with an edge because they can now deploy some of the models and they can work with machine learning and make sure it's available through a website, which is also an added an additional benefit of web development. But there's tons of options for people who learn web development, and it's usually the first gateway for a lot of people who are getting into software dev. Okay, so let's look at the structure of the web over here. I think I should have cited this image, but I can't remember where we got it from, but that's fine. But what you'll see here is this is how the web looks like. We usually have users on one front, right? And then these users will tend to access a site through a browser, right? And when you access the site through a browser, you get to interact with the user interface of that particular site. So this user interface is mostly processed by the HTML markup language. We'll have the CSS styling and JavaScript as well. And this is what we'll call the front-end layer of our web application. So mostly front-end devs will be concerned about this user interface, and they'll tend to play around with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? Whereas backend developers, now you're more concerned about the data in the backend, how features work, how things work in the backend. So you're not really giving your focus into design, but you're giving your focus more into functionality, data storage, databases, and the likes. And you'll mostly deal with the code that we store in virtual servers. You'll mostly deal with databases as well. And this is what I will call the backend layer of that development architecture. So some of you might be visual, focus on the front end layer. Some of you might be focused on the functionality, so you focus on the backend layer. Okay, so now let's talk about getting started now. But before we get started, does anyone have a question for me? Any questions? Okay, so no questions. Now let's get started. So in the getting started section, I'll be talking about what skills you should have, whether you want to get into the front-end track or the back-end track. This is quite essential for whatever pathway you want to take up in web development. Cool. So the first thing I recommend you get started with is have an integrated development environment. You'll see people call them IDEs most of the time. This is where you get to work on your code, right? You get to run them as well. You tend to understand more about IDEs the more you start using them. But the IDEs I mostly recommend will be the local IDEs. These are development environments that you can download on your laptop. So you could use a notebook file, but you want to get that syntax highlighting, you want to get that run terminal down there. Like you just want to make your web development as efficient as possible. Some of them come with plugins for autocomplete for your code. So an IDE is essential when you're writing down most of your code. And that's what you should download as you're getting started. The IDE I mostly recommend will be Visual Studio Code. But you shouldn't go wrong if you use Sublime Text or Atom. There's a couple of IDs. I can't list them all. That's a very, very long list. But most people, Visual Studio Code tends to be the leader over here, and Sublime Text are close second. If you don't have the space on your laptop to work on a local IDE, or you have one of those weird times where you don't have a laptop and you're going from place to place trying to find ways you can work on your code, we have online IDEs as an option as well. And one good example of an online IDE where you can code up and connect even to GitHub would be Replit. GitHub Code Space is also a very good one. And the good thing about GitHub Code Spaces is it's entirely Visual Studio Code but online. So I know it's still on beta stage. I don't know whether people can still access it fully, but if you're able to enroll like last year, I think you should have access right now. So that's also an option. There's also tons of different online IDEs. Some programming languages might have language-specific IDEs as well. So watch out for that. I think Python has one. I've forgotten the name, like Python Everywhere or Python Anywhere, something of that sort. But you can check out Replit and GitHub Code Spaces, particularly Replit, if you want to just have an IDE online or you don't have the time to install a local IDE. I still recommend have a local IDE in the first place. Okay, so once you have an integrated development environment, the next thing is understanding what Git is, understanding Git version control. So this is a concept that I recommend any developer learn, whether you're a web developer. Okay, so I'm seeing someone has suggested something here. PyCharm, Collab, Jupyter Notebooks. That's fine. Collab, Jupyter Notebooks will tend to be more for data scientists, but I will put PyCharm over there as well. But Google Collab, Jupyter Notebooks, I would leave that to data scientists. As a web dev, you'd want to avoid the IPython notebooks and work on proper IDEs. Okay, so let's talk about Git version control. One, it's essential that you learn what Git version control is. It's essential that you understand the different tools out there that offer this Git version control. Most of them allow you to store your code, and they're able to allow you to see how your code changes over time. And they're very, very good for collaboration. So because we tend to work in teams a lot, there's no way you can avoid Git in the first place. So one, I'd recommend you learn how to work with Git Bash. Git Bash are the commands for Git that allows you to push your code to a platform such as GitHub that allow you to pull code. Essentially, they allow you to play around with your repositories, your code repositories, as much as possible by pushing them to a platform such as GitHub, getting them, adding changes, right? We even have Bash commands to make it simple for you to deploy it as well. Make branches. So I can't really go through this as well. I think having a workshop talk about Git would be good. If you see an event on Git in particular, go for it. But learning Git Bash is the first aspect here. And after that, once you have an understanding of Git Bash, which is the Git commands as well, you should be free to use some of the common Git tools or solutions out there. The dominant one here is GitHub, the one I definitely recommend. GitLab is still a very, very good option, mostly for enterprise, and Bitbucket as well. But for most people who are not necessarily enterprise, you'll tend to settle for GitHub. Okay. The other thing that I'll not talk about as much here will be package managers. You can go ahead and explore package managers such as NPM and Yarn. Most of these things will just start occurring to you, and you'll start learning more about them whenever you're getting to deeper code. Whenever you're starting to do your backend dev, you should be able to start interacting with this. Okay, now those are the general basics. Now let's get to the front end track. If you do have a question for me, drop it. If you have suggestions, if you think I've left out something before we get started with front end, just let me know in the chat as well. Okay, so for front end development, I will start first of all with the web development essentials. And these are essentials that even if you want to concentrate on the back end, I recommend that you learn this just for the basic minimum. It's very, very sad to be a backend developer and you don't understand HTML or you're not well familiar with how to do just the basic CSS styling. You don't have to be a good CSS designer there. There's never learning full CSS in the first place, but at least be able to write HTML, CSS code. Because yes, you'll need that at some point, even if you'll just be throwing yourself down to Python code or Java code as you work through frameworks. Cool. So here are the essentials. The first thing we talk about is HTML. That's the hypertext markup language. This is the language that allows us to write onto the web. Think of the web as a Google Doc, right? And to edit out our Google Doc, this is the syntax we use. We use HTML. So it allows us to stipulate what's the heading 1, what's the heading 2, right? The same way when you jump onto a Word doc, you can say, this is the heading 1. Let me put a list and number it. Let me put a list and bullet it. So HTML is our way of making web some sort of Google Doc by having different tags for different types of elements and giving it that structure. So yes, so it could be paragraphs, could be headings, it could be images. There's a lot. This is how we write on the web, and HTML is the basic starting point for any web developer. Second aspect is when you guys look at your Google Docs, right? If you just put in a heading 1, a heading 2, and then you have a paragraph here, you add in an image. At times you can probably drop in a video as well and embed it. Most of the time it does not look as appealing. So what we want to do now, also with HTML, whenever we just do that tagging, right? Different things will have different sizes. They'll be more bold if it's a heading. Right, the list will have like a number before it or a bullet before it, which is okay, but it's going to take the basic font, it's going to take the basic color as well. There's not going to be any design element to it. So what we do to add the basic design, right, not basic design now, to add design to our basic website is CSS. So these are cascading style sheets. We use CSS for styling. Once again, this is bulky. a bulky resource, so you don't need to know the whole of it. Just know the basics that you'll tend to use from time to time. So CSS is definitely the second place you need to look at. And yes, this allows you to add styling to your basic websites built with HTML. Once you're well familiar with CSS, I recommend checking out CSS layouts and responsive design. It's a very key thing. A lot of people are accessing websites through their mobile phones. So website responsivity is more than important. And some of these layouts will allow you to work on responsive design quite easily. One good, some examples will be CSS Grid or CSS Flexbox. Right, those are some skills that you should definitely learn as you're going through this. There's a very good YouTube videos as well on responsive design by the king of CSS. I've forgotten his name. I'll probably share that as a resource that you guys can check out as well. Cool. After that, you can expand your CSS knowledge by learning more about CSS or UI frameworks. This just gives you structure around CSS as well. They're very good tools to make your life easier or more efficient. Some good examples will be Tailwind CSS or Bootstrap. You guys might have heard of it as well. I would recommend learning Bootstrap after having a bit of JavaScript knowledge, but I'll still place it here under CSS frameworks. Tailwind CSS is becoming really popular, and I definitely recommend that. Cool. One CSS framework that I've left out is SAS or SCSS. Also a very good framework here that you should check out the moment you're familiar with HTML and basic CSS. Cool. Now, if you're able to learn HTML, CSS, if you're into backend development, you can probably just leave it out at CSS layouts and responsive design because you'll tend not to work as much on the front end. So don't go extra with learning your frameworks or user interface design. But if you're a front end dev, just make sure you follow through everything over here. But for backend developers, I'll get to that in a few. Okay. Now, for those of you who really want to get into front end, a key thing is being able to design your websites before you actually build them. It's being able to design the UI and the user experience as well. Very important thing. So I recommend learning about UI UX design principles. Right, there's a lot of YouTube tutorials on UI UX design principles. In fact, the best way to learn UI UX design principles might be to look at different guidelines for UI UX across different companies. I'd recommend checking the UI UX guidelines for Google, UI UX guidelines for Airbnb. Those tend to be the dominant forces there because when you look at all the sites they produce, they tend to have very clean design and it's highly optimized for conversion in the first place. So think about that. But the main skill you want to learn here is you want to learn how to wireframe or prototype a website with tools such as Figma or Adobe XD. I personally am a fan of Figma. I recommend using Figma. That will be my number one recommendation for anyone who's learning user interface design. Okay, so with an understanding of these essentials, you should be okay to build your website, right? You can build your simple websites. You can build websites for businesses, and they'll look pretty good so long as you're pretty skilled with this. This can take you about a month as well if you're giving it as much time as possible, particularly when you want to learn the CSS UI frameworks. So think about a 1 month investment here, and you should be okay to build a website in the first place. That's usually good advancement. However, now for proper front-end development, this is where now we really get started. Yes, we have started. That's more of like the visual aspect. Now we're trying to add a bit of interactivity. All front-end developers should definitely learn JavaScript. On JavaScript, you want to learn the programming basics here. That's vanilla JavaScript. You'd also want to explore how JavaScript is used for front-end. A good example here would also be learning libraries such as jQuery as well. So learning how JavaScript is used on the front end is quite key, and jQuery is a very good library to also test out as you're learning this. Think about array methods, think about JavaScript objects. There's a lot you can learn here. You don't want to just learn the basics. You also want to learn JavaScript objects and the object-oriented programming version of it, just to be well familiar with it. Additional skills would be how you can handle JSON and XML with JavaScript. Think about how HTTP requests are handled. That's a skill you definitely need to understand as well as you're learning. So I've just talked about the bare bones basics here. I will share a resource where you can get an idea of JavaScript end to end, but all front-end developers should really learn JavaScript. That's the language for the front end. Okay, now once you learn JavaScript, now you can go ahead to advanced frontend. Now for advanced frontend, I did say that SAS and SCSS, SAS is a good CSS framework to learn. Very, very common as well, quite utilitarian when you think about it. So for those of you thinking of expanding your frontend skills, learning SAS is a very, very good skill. The other aspect would be now to focus on a frontend framework. And the most common front-end framework, and one that I definitely recommend, and as soon as you have this, you can even start applying for jobs for front-end with no stress, would be React.js. Uh, Angular is also an option, and Vue is also an option. However, I would definitely recommend anyone who's just a beginner, you're getting started, learn React. That's the market leader at the moment. Get that front-end framework, and so long as you know JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and you know how to design the things with Figma and do your UI prototype, you can now start applying for front-end jobs. Okay, so long as you have projects. Another skill that I recommend all front-end developers having, because it's a bit sad if you don't, is understanding how WordPress works, right? Up to 40% of our websites are still being run on WordPress. It's a very, very simple tool for a lot of people to build websites on. And it won't take you as much time to learn, but to really, really be a WordPress expert, to know how to optimize it for security, performance, right? Deployment as well. It might take some time, but just learning how to design on WordPress is something you should definitely learn. Even big companies are using WordPress for certain tasks. Like Microsoft uses WordPress for their blog. We've also seen Facebook use WordPress for their blog at some point. So yeah, do not discount WordPress. Don't say it's not entirely for developers. I think you still need your developer knowledge should help you out with WordPress better. But do not get to the market if you don't understand that rather simple tool that has very, very different customizations based on your experience level. Okay, the next one will be web hosting and deployment. You definitely need to understand how to throw your websites online. Learn about cPanel hosting. So that will be the first type of hosting that you'll tend to encounter a lot. Second one would be static hosting. For those of you who would want to create static websites here, probably learn about tools such as Netlify, GitHub Pages as well, which I think most of you will tend to use for deploying your portfolio websites, right? Or Heroku. I wouldn't call Heroku necessarily a static hosting website because you can still deploy like non-static sites over there. But that's something to look at. But also think about cloud hosting. Can you like deploy your website on AWS or Google Cloud? One framework to use for AWS will be AWS Amplify, or we're thinking about Google Cloud Firebase as well. I think Microsoft Azure has its own. I mostly use Amplify here, and I've boldened the ones I recommend for you guys. Final thing, understand how domains work. So you definitely need to understand how to peg a domain to your website when you're hosting it. Learn about content delivery networks. Cloudflare will be the tool you want to learn how to use here. Also learn about SSL certificates, right? That padlock we see at the top of websites over here as well for security. Learn what they are and also how you can add in an SSL certificate to your domain and peg it to your website at the end of the day. For domains, you can get this on Google Domains or Namecheap. For CDN and even the SSL certificate, do not struggle buying an SSL certificate. So long as you're using the Cloudflare CDN, they also have options to get their free SSL certificates there for about 10 years. Okay, and that's it for the front end. Is there anyone who'd love to, who has a question for the front end? Those of you who'd love to concentrate on the front end track and have questions based on what I've talked about? Okay, no questions. If you come up with a question, feel free to just drop it on the chat as well. I'll be checking them out in a few. No questions from anyone. Okay. What's the difference between cPanel and static hosting? Okay, so I wouldn't want to talk about this in depth right now, but cPanel hosting, first of all, let me just say, cPanel is a tool that a lot of web hosting companies use to allow you to deploy your sites online. cPanel hosting is not static because it can take in a full web application, so it does not necessarily have to be a static site. So what does a static site entail? A static site is a site that only contains JavaScript, CSS, and no HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Right, it tends not to have a lot of the code functionality. It's not dynamic. There's no like features. It's just like you've designed something you want it to be viewed out there. Think about a PDF document versus a Google Doc. For a PDF, you've designed everything, the info's out there. You just want someone to go out and read it. Whereas for a Google Doc, you have this sharing tools. People can add in comments and likes. So that's what I would say. I'd say a static hosting is more like a PDF, whereas your cPanel hosting or cloud hosting will tend to be more. Okay, so a static site is more like a PDF, and a dynamic site is more like, let's say, a Microsoft Word or Google Doc in the first place. So for one, it's dynamic, it's changing. There's a lot of user interactivity that determines what's being shown to the end user. Whereas for static, is you've already pre-designed and pre-generated the content for someone to view this. There's also ways of converting dynamic sites to static sites. If the content like takes a while before it changes, and you still want to boost up performance, you can always, let's say, one I've seen is for WordPress, where WordPress sites, you can build a WordPress site that's a dynamic application. WordPress is dynamic. And then you can make it static. And each and every single month, if you change your website or like there's data that's changing, you can just generate a new static site off of the changes over there. Cool. So static site, generally more visual. If you want to add any interaction, let's say you want people to fill in forms, or you want to add a search bar as well, you'll tend to use microservices or other tools through APIs. So that's how static sites tend to add in the user interactivity. But in real sense, you're just building something that's quite visual. Whereas for your dynamic site, it allows you to add in the code that adds in the functionality. Users need to do this, and the content is dynamic. It changes based on different interactions. A good example of a dynamic site would be YouTube, right? The moment I reload that page again, new videos are recommended to me. So it's quite dynamic. It's changing from time to time as well. Whereas static, it's just your basic restaurant website where they have a menu and they have the location, and that's pretty much it. Okay, now the difference between static and dynamic sites is that static sites will tend to perform faster. So if your site does not need the dynamic element, I would recommend having it as a static site, just for the sake of performance and security. Actually, you should check out docs on Jamstack. I would recommend that. Probably something that I'll share with you guys right after this. Let me just open it up and I'll get to that so that you guys can see what Jamstack is doing on the static infrastructure. Okay, now let's talk about the back end. And let me see. Okay, is there ageism prevalent in web development? I don't know. I wouldn't call that. I think I see people of different ages get jobs all through. Okay, coming to think of it, I don't think I've interacted with a lot of. Okay, this is quite tough. I don't think your age matters in the industry, right? But you'll tend to see a lot of developers will tend to be young. They'll tend to be in their 20s, in their 30s. More senior ones will tend to be in their 40s as well. I really can't call this. Probably I need to do some data analysis on that to understand the average age for developers. But regardless of what age you are, so long as you have the skills, you're pretty much good to go. People care more about the skills you have rather than the age. Once again, the good thing about development is it's a skill-based career. The bias is very, very minimal, because if you can build stuff, there's someone who wants you to build stuff for them. Okay. I'm not saying there won't be bias. There will still be bias, but it's less of an issue, right? As in careers where you're kind of hiring people based on your thought on how they can handle that. Think about a communication job. Whereas for web dev, if you have the skills and we can test out that you know the skills, then you can get started on the job and you can start building stuff. Okay, but that's not a question I'm quite vast to answer. Probably we need to do a lot of data analysis for that. Okay, would static also allow having embedded CDNs? Yeah, you use most static sites, you'll tend to use the CDN for additional performance. Yeah, in fact, Cloudflare is very, very good. Even before I talk about Cloudflare, the solution I offered here for front-end for static deployment, that is Netlify, comes with its own CDN as well. So static sites work really, really well with the CDN. Okay, no more questions. Let's talk about the backend now. Yes, so For those of you who are more into front-end, it's fine. Feel free to drop off the call if you're not interested in the back-end. If you still would love to learn, it's okay. Now let's talk about the back-end. So what should you learn if you want to build the back-end architecture of websites? The good starting point will tend to be learning a programming language. So you need to have a proper programming skills to be able to handle the backend. And some of the programming languages I recommend will be Python, JavaScript. And the good thing is because you're learning the front end in JavaScript, it becomes very, very easy for you to upskill onto the backend with the same language. And here we are recommending using JavaScript Node. Other languages will tend to be Ruby. PHP is also a language. I always feel it's a bit outdated, but it's still being used as well. Check out statistics on Stack Overflow on the usage of these languages. It gives you an idea of what languages are popular. You can also look at job sites to see what programming languages are driving in demand as well. We do have data on that. I don't know that I'll be able to share, but we have open data on our GitHub channel. Probably I will share our GitHub so that you can see the popularity of these different programming languages. Okay, so I can't write them all. I've just chosen a few: Python, Ruby, PHP, Java, C++. Think about what else am I leaving here? There is a lot of languages, Rust, so I didn't want to go through all of them. Golang is also a very, very good language here. What you just need to do is do your research, try to identify a language you think you'd love to learn, and go ahead and learn it. I'd recommend Python, JavaScript. I think Ruby is quite good. I also think Golang is a very, very good language to learn. Those will be my recommendations because of the demand as well, and the simplicity of learning, those four in particular. Now, once you have proper programming skills with your chosen language, the next thing would be to understand backend frameworks and to learn how to use backend frameworks with your chosen language. So if you opt for Python, you tend to go ahead and learn Django or Flask. That's the backend framework for those of you who are using Python, the popular ones. If you learn Node.js, which is now the JavaScript backend, now you can go ahead and learn the Express framework as well, so that you can start building backend applications, backend web apps with Express with JavaScript. If you learn Ruby, we have a framework called Ruby on Rails. If you learn PHP, there's a framework called Laravel. If you learn, I think that was C#, you have .NET as a framework as well. So I've just mentioned examples based on the programming languages I had listed, but what I would check out is when you learn a programming language, also check out what frameworks that programming language offers for backend development. It allows you to understand what pathway you need to follow. So there's tons of programming languages, there's tons of backend frameworks. Just check out statistics, look at how many people are using it, look at job opportunities. Are there job opportunities with your chosen framework or programming language? And when you learn a programming language, you want to advance to the framework pegged to that programming language. Now, as you're learning your backend framework, you'll start interacting with databases a lot. And this is now a very, very key skill for any backend developer. Learn how to use NoSQL databases, so they're not using SQL necessarily. Most of them will tend to be based on JSON. One good example here will be MongoDB. However, not all applications will run entirely on a NoSQL database. SQL databases are still as more popular than NoSQL databases. So knowing how to structure out SQL databases, how to do SQL queries as well, and how to play around or rather work around the MySQL, Postgres, and any other SQL type of database is a very important skill for any backend developer. More importantly, it's important for you to understand how you can integrate these databases with your programming backend, that backend framework that you're using for programming. Another skill when it comes to working in databases is learning how to work with REST APIs. At times you'll be working on applications, right, where you're getting the data from an external application and you're not running that database in particular. So knowing how to work around APIs is a very, very important skill for any backend developer. I would also say it's a very important skill for front-end developers as well, because as you build static sites, you'll tend to rely on microservices, which you'll tend to access them through APIs if you want to add that sort of interactivity that you're not necessarily concerned of. So if I wanted to add a form plugin to my site, I don't want to go ahead and build a form from scratch and handle the form database I could go ahead and look at Wufoo forms. So that's a good example, or Typeform, and I integrate it to my website with an API and just leave it all out there. Okay, so APIs is one. When you're learning REST APIs, learn how to access data through REST APIs, as well as how you can create REST APIs for your application so that people can access data from your application as well. I think learning how to access is more important for a start, and then over time you can start learning how to build the API infrastructure for your own application. Some additional skills you need to learn for your backend development will be deployment and DevOps. Let me talk about some of the skills over here. Cloud computing is a very, very good skill to have. Most companies want people who are versed with the cloud, whether that's AWS, Microsoft Azure, or Google Cloud. AWS is the market leader over here. Learn about different web servers, that's Apache and Nginx. What do they do in the first place? So learn about these web servers. Let's talk about the serverless architecture, right? Do you know how to play around with containers and work with containers? Docker or Kubernetes as well. Docker is the recommended tool to learn over here. The other aspect will now be site rendering, what I've talked about a bit too much today. I've never talked about static and server-side rendered sites as much as today. So you can go ahead and learn about site rendering, where we have server-side rendering. And here we have frameworks such as Next.js. So for those of you who will be learning JavaScript, who will be learning React, you can learn Next.js for your server-side rendering. The other option is for those of you who opted to use the Vue Frontend framework as well, you can now go ahead and learn Nuxt.js for server-side rendering. I think this is a very important skill for front-end developers as well. The other thing, now this is more for front-end developers than it is for back-end developers. It's going to be static site generators. So learn of the Gatsby framework by React as well. So Gatsby is a very, very good skill to learn. That's if you have a React background. GridSum is that alternative for Vue. Jekyll if you're using Ruby. Hugo if you're using the Golang language. So different languages will tend to have different static site generators. But I would recommend, if you're learning front-end, learn React. So that when it comes down to server-side rendering and static site, you only upskill into Gatsby or Next.js. My second recommended front-end framework was Vue. So GridSum and Nuxt would be my recommendation, whether you want to do a static site or a server-side rendered site. Okay. Now, the third skill that's coming up quite well is GraphQL. This is an alternative to your REST APIs as well. A skill that's really, really upcoming, and I recommend looking through it. Learn a bit on state management, that's Redux and Vuex as well. As some examples, Redux will tend to be for people on the React pathway as well. And for those of you who want to get into TypeScript, which is an alternative to JavaScript, so TypeScript is also a very, very common language over here. It's pretty much based on JavaScript, but I think it's neater to write, and a lot of companies are starting to take in TypeScript. I personally don't know much about TypeScript, but it is really, really growing on demand. I probably should read more about it. I've read a lot about it. I've just never felt the urge to shift to that, but I think I might be upskilling into that soon enough. Okay, let's talk about taking it to the next level, which is the extras that you definitely need to learn as an individual to take your skills to the next level. Now, so far you guys are familiar with front-end and back-end. Now, if you want to start looking for jobs, data structures and algorithms are a skill I recommend anyone looking at. If you want to expand your job options, you can go ahead and learn mobile development. There's a big advantage here. For those of you who've done the front-end track with React, you can just go ahead and learn React Native and start doing mobile development with JavaScript. Or you can opt to go ahead and learn the Dart programming language and use the Flutter framework for mobile dev. I would say there's a culture, there's a trend that's upcoming here on mobile dev where people are starting to move off of your one, you know how the different how mobile apps are created in the past. You have to create your Android application with Java or Kotlin, and then you need to come and create your iOS application separately as well with Swift, and that's just too much repetition. So this hybrid frameworks that allow you to build an Android and iOS application with the same code base are really gaining popularity. Companies such as Spotify are already using them. So I recommend learning about this because we see trends moving towards them. Cool. If you want to build desktop applications, there's also an option for you to learn a framework like Electron to learn how to do desktop apps. Cocoa is also an option. We have Swing as well. Electron tends to be the market leader here. A skill here that you should look at and learn more about is progressive web apps. So these are web applications that someone can download as a mobile app and save on their website home screen. I think you guys might have interacted with websites that have this option as well. Very key. And you can also think of learning how to employ machine learning in web applications. So an application such as YouTube has a lot of machine learning models running behind it to recommend videos to people. So think about you expanding into machine learning as well and seeing whether you can start building websites that employ machine learning models in them. Okay, some frameworks that you can learn here will tend to be TensorFlow, which is also available for JavaScript. So Python and JavaScript people, if you opt for Python, you can learn scikit-learn for your models. We have PyTorch as well. So there's a lot of options here. If you guys are interested in machine learning or data science, you can always come to our next event on the data science pathway. But I think that's it for us from today. Just a general overview of the roadmap you should go through. I know this is a mouthful. You cannot take in everything that I've talked about today. So what I would go ahead and just tell you is, first thing you need to ask yourself when you're getting started, learn the essentials, HTML, CSS, for anyone. And then after that, ask yourself, do you want to concentrate on the front end or the back end? If you want to concentrate on the front end, learn your frameworks, learn your UI design, learn JavaScript, and then go ahead and learn a front end framework such as React, and you'll be good to go. For anyone, you definitely need to know how to do web hosting and deployment. Cool. Now, for those backend developers, once you learn HTML and CSS, definitely learn JavaScript. That's very important. So once you have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you should ask yourself, what programming language do you want to work on for the backend? The popular ones will be Python, JavaScript, Ruby, Golang. There's a lot over here. So choose your language, like you could choose Python. Once you choose Python, learn how to program in Python. After that, choose a backend framework that's pegged to your language. You could go ahead and choose Django. Go ahead and learn Django, the Django backend framework. After that, learn how to work with databases, and you can start calling yourself a backend developer. And some of these additional skills are things that I'll just send you the slides, and you can look at them so that you know how you can the small different skills that you also need to keep learning regardless of what track you're going on to. So that's it for our session today. Let me take in a couple of questions. Do you guys have questions for me? Okay, so we've recorded this session, so if you missed any bit of it, you'll be able to get access to it. Not a big problem as well. I'll also be sharing the slides with you, and I'll also share some recommended resources for you to get started on HTML, CSS, JavaScript, or any programming language. Okay, what SQL seems more popular? Postgres is very popular. MySQL is also as popular. I think just learn how to work with a typical SQL database, and there shouldn't be a big trouble upskilling from one to the other. Yeah, so just learn SQL queries, how to design databases, right? So keep that in mind as well. And then you can focus on either MySQL or Postgres. And so long as you have a background there, getting into the Oracle database would not be bad, or the Microsoft will not be bad, so long as the underlying query will be SQL. Any other question? Okay, thank you very much, guys, for your time. I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you all for being able to attend this. And thank you all for those who are able to introduce themselves. And I hope that whatever we've shared today is as useful to you. And I hope that you'll be able to use it in charting your own pathway as a web developer. Have a nice time wherever you are. Good day if it's still early on your side. Good night if you're getting to bed. And good evening for those of you who are on Central European and Central African time.